Okay, we just learned about equivalent fractions, and today we're going to learn how to create equivalent fractions. So let's cut it out and glue it on the next page. Okay, we just learned about equivalent fractions, and today we're going to talk about how we can make our own equivalent fractions. So to make your own equivalent fractions, we first have to understand some different types of fractions that we might have. We might have some simpler fractions. Simpler fractions are ones that are made out of smaller numbers. They're easier to visualize. So if I said, close your eyes and picture 1/2 of a pizza, then you could close your eyes and visualize that. It's simple to understand. Some fractions are harder to understand. If I said, okay, close your eyes, and I want you to think of 50 hundredths of a pizza, that's a little bit harder to visualize. So sometimes you're going to have a simpler fraction, and sometimes you're going to have a harder fraction. But it doesn't really matter what kind of fraction you have. You can create another fraction that is equivalent. So if you start with a simple fraction, you can make a harder fraction that's equivalent. And if you start with a harder fraction, you can create a simpler fraction that is equivalent. So let's just start by talking about the simpler fractions. So we have 1/2, 1/3, 2/3, 3/4. All of these are pretty easy to visualize, but we can turn them into a harder fraction by using multiplication. And if you think about it, that makes sense. If we have smaller numbers and we want to get bigger, then we have to add or multiply, right? So we're going to multiply in order to get bigger numbers that still represent the same portion of the whole. So let's start with 1/2. It says, what do you multiply by? Well, this is easy because you can multiply by any number you want and it will work. So if we have 1/2, let's say we're going to choose 3 as the number we multiply by. Whatever multiplier you choose, we chose 3, but if you would have chose 2 or 7, it doesn't matter. As long as you remember, you have to multiply the numerator and the denominator both. So here we see that we chose 3 as the multiplier. So we're going to multiply the numerator by 3 and the denominator by 3. So 1 times 3 is 3. 2 times 3 is 6. Notice it says it's an equivalent fraction, but it's a harder fraction to visualize. Now 1/2 equals 3/6. Well, when we were learning about equivalent fractions, that was actually one of our examples. 1/2 does equal 3/6. So anytime you're starting with a simpler fraction and you're trying to create a harder fraction, then all you have to do is multiply the numerator and the denominator by any number you like. The higher your multiplier, the harder the fraction. The smaller your multiplier, the simpler the fraction. So if we multiply to get harder fractions, what do you think we do when we start with a harder fraction that we want to be simpler? All right, so here are some harder fractions. They're hard to visualize. It's hard to know how much exactly 10/12 is just in your mind. But we can take a harder fraction and we can convert it into a simpler fraction by using division. And that makes sense if you think about it. If we want numbers that are smaller, we have to subtract or divide. So we're going to be using division. So what do we divide by? Any number that goes evenly into both the numerator and denominator. Okay, so this is different. When we start with a simpler and we're getting harder, we can pick any number we want. But not this way. we have to pick a number that goes evenly into the numerator and the denominator. It has to be the same number. So whatever divisor you choose, make sure that you can use it to divide both the numerator and the denominator. So if we're starting with 10/12, we can't choose 5 as the number we divide by, because 5 does go into 10. 5 times 2 is 10, but 5 does not go into 12. There isn't anything that I can multiply 5 by to get 12, so we can't use 5. Can you think of a number we could use? I'll give you a hint. Both of these are even, so we'll choose 2 as my divisor, because 2 goes evenly into both 10 and 12. So instead of multiplying like we did over here, we're going to divide to get a simpler fraction. So 10 divided by 2 is 5, and 12 divided by 2 is 6. So now we have an equivalent fraction. 10/12 is the exact same amount as 5/6, but 5/6 is made up of smaller numbers and is simpler to understand and visualize. So creating equivalent fractions is something that you're going to have to do as we continue to learn more and more fraction skills. You may have to do it to compare fractions. You may have to do it to add or subtract fractions. But as long as you remember that you can create equivalent fractions that are harder, or you can create harder fractions that are simpler, then you'll be able to do those skills super easily. Okay, next time we're going to learn about another type of equivalent fractions with mixed numbers and improper fractions. See you then.